The air smelled of pine and disinfectant. On the edge of the compound, inside a long, low wooden building marked Infirmary, a group of captured Japanese Army doctors stood in silence. Their uniforms were faded, their rank insignia gone, but their posture remained rigid. Soldiers to the end. They had been told the Americans would show them their hospital, and most expected a crude dispensary, perhaps a few cots and a single nurse with bandages. What they found stopped them at the door. Bright white light flooded the room from overhead fixtures. Stainless steel trays gleamed beside enamel wash basins. Against one wall stood a full X-ray unit, humming softly, its power cables coiled like veins. Nearby, a dental chair reclined under a mechanical lamp. Bottles of antiseptic lined the shelves beside unfamiliar vials labeled Penicillin, U.S. Army Medical Supply. One of the prisoners, a former field surgeon from the Philippines campaign, stared in disbelief. "They treat prisoners with this?" he whispered to his interpreter. An American medical officer looked up from a clipboard, smiled faintly, and answered in slow, deliberate English, "Yes, doctor. The war's over. We take care of everyone now." For the first time since capture, the Japanese doctors felt something they couldn't name. Not humiliation, not fear, but a deep, quiet shock. In their empire, surrender was shame. In this place, mercy had machinery. Two systems of war. Two ideas of humanity. By the end of 1944, more than 425,000 Axis prisoners of war were held across the United States. Germans, Italians, and a growing number of Japanese. Their treatment followed rules few armies had ever taken so seriously. The 1929 Geneva Convention on Prisoners of War, a code the United States had signed and ratified long before the conflict began. The convention's language was clear. Prisoners were to be fed, housed, and medically treated to the same standard as the captor's own troops. They could not be humiliated, starved, or used for forced labor beyond non-military tasks. They retained the right to worship, to receive mail, and to keep their rank. To most Americans, and to the Army Medical Department in particular, those rules were not simply legal requirements. They were a moral statement about what separated civilization from barbarism. But in Asia, that same document meant little. The Empire of Japan, though it had signed the convention, had never formally ratified it. Its military code, drawn from the Bushido tradition, held that surrender was the ultimate disgrace. To be taken prisoner was to abandon one's honor and one's emperor. The result was a worldview where compassion for captives was not virtue but weakness. In Japanese hands, Allied prisoners were expendable labor. In American hands, captured Japanese soldiers were a test of conscience. The world they came from. When American troops began capturing Japanese forces in significant numbers, on Guadalcanal, Tarawa, Saipan, and Leyte, they were astonished at how few surrendered alive. Out of thousands of defenders, often fewer than 100 survived. Many had fought to the last bullet or chosen suicide over capture. Those who did survive were usually wounded, delirious, or too weak to resist. Their own army considered them dead already. Japanese broadcasts rarely mentioned prisoners, and families at home received notices that sons and fathers had fallen in honorable battle. In the camps of Rabaul and Burma, captured Allied soldiers endured starvation, disease, and forced labor under officers who believed mercy to be treason. The ideological divide between the two nations' military cultures could hardly have been wider. One treated prisoners as living evidence of failure. The other saw their treatment as proof of victory's moral legitimacy. The American decision, by late 1942, Washington faced a difficult question: what to do with the rising number of Japanese prisoners captured across the Pacific. The War Department decided to bring many of them to the continental United States. The reasons were practical: to relieve pressure on island garrisons, to ensure security, and to demonstrate Allied humanity. Yet there was also symbolism in it. America wanted the world to see that even its enemies would be treated within the bounds of law. Thus began one of the most extraordinary logistical operations of the war. Transports and hospital ships carried hundreds of captured soldiers and officers across the ocean. They landed first in Hawaii, then at San Francisco, and were distributed among a network of inland camps: Camp McCoy in Wisconsin, Camp Clarinda in Iowa, Camp Clinton in Mississippi, and others scattered across the heartland. There, far from the battlefields, the prisoners found clean barracks, hot showers, and something they had not expected: routine medical inspection. Every incoming POW underwent a complete physical examination, chest X-ray, and vaccination. Tuberculosis screening was mandatory. Wounds were treated, fractures set, infections cleaned and dressed. American military surgeons, some only weeks removed from Pacific campaigns, were now healing men they had once fought. Medicine as policy. The U.S. Army's medical system in 1944 was among the most advanced on Earth. Mobile surgical units, mass production of sulfa drugs, and, above all, penicillin, the miracle antibiotic first produced in quantity in 1943, had changed battlefield survival rates. The Army Medical Department viewed POWs as its responsibility under the same ethical framework. The logic was bureaucratic but also moral. Infection, disease, and neglect could spread, demoralize, or invite enemy retaliation. Good care was both humane and strategic, but for the Japanese this was incomprehensible. In their training, captured enemies were beneath treatment. In their own army, wounded soldiers were often left to die rather than consume resources. Medical supplies were hoarded for the healthy. To find that their captors possessed not only antiseptics and anesthesia, but also X-rays, laboratories, and working dental equipment, was almost impossible to reconcile with their worldview. The arrival of the doctors, among those shipped to the United States, were a small number of Japanese medical officers, men who had served as surgeons and medics in the Imperial Army. Their capture came under varying circumstances. Some had been wounded and captured at field hospitals. Others surrendered alongside isolated garrisons. Most expected humiliation or execution. Instead, they were invited to participate in the medical wards of American camps. At first, it felt like a trick. The Americans allowed them to assist in examinations, interpret for other prisoners, and observe operations. They were issued clean white coats. The first time they were led into a camp infirmary and saw an X-ray tube glowing, they thought it a staged demonstration. The presence of penicillin, still a precious commodity even for U.S. forces, stunned them. One diary entry, later recovered by U.S. intelligence, contained a single line: "Their hospitals are brighter than our headquarters." The meaning was less about light than revelation. By the time Japan surrendered, hundreds of its captured physicians had seen more advanced medical care inside American prison camps than they had ever witnessed in their own Army hospitals. What they learned there, and what it made them question, would echo long after the war. When captivity became a classroom, the first Japanese prisoners of war arrived. In the continental United States in early 1943, they were few in number compared to the German captives who flooded in after North Africa. But they were the most ideologically rigid. Each prisoner had been taught from childhood that capture was a fate worse than death. They expected cruelty, starvation, or at best, humiliation. Instead, they found something far stranger: order. At Camp McCoy in Wisconsin, Camp Clarinda in Iowa, and Camp Clinton in Mississippi, barbed wire surrounded neat rows of barracks painted army brown. Beyond the fences stretched farmland and forest. The POWs received 3 hot meals a day, regular mail delivery, and small wages for camp labor. For the Japanese, this was disorienting enough, but it was inside the medical wards that their worldview began to unravel. Most Japanese POW doctors began their journey in hospital tents on Pacific Islands: Saipan, Tinian, Guam, or Okinawa, where the wounded were treated with whatever could be scavenged. Bandages were boiled and reused, scalpels dulled from overuse, anesthetics stretched until they were dangerous. When the Americans captured these islands, Surviving medics were taken to field hospitals run by the U.S. Army Medical Corps. There, they encountered Western triage for the first time. Wounds cleaned systematically, blood transfusions given with new plastic tubing, sulfa powder dusted like ritual over every incision. From there, the prisoners were transported across the Pacific under guard but treated not as cattle, rather as patients. On hospital ships, they saw white sheets, electric lights, and sterilizers that hissed like engines. Even before reaching the mainland, the cultural shock had begun. One Imperial Army physician later wrote in his diary, translated years after the war, "They heal us because they can, not because we deserve it. This I cannot understand." Arrival in the American heartland. When the ships reached San Francisco, the prisoners were processed, cataloged, and sent by train inland, hundreds of miles from any coast, far from escape. Camp McCoy was one of the first to receive Japanese officers, including several doctors. The camp's hospital was modest by U.S. standards, but to the prisoners it looked like a city's central clinic. Tiled floors, electric autoclaves, even framed medical charts on the walls. Each morning began with inspection. American medics made rounds with thermometers and blood pressure cuffs. The Japanese prisoners, still in their khaki remnants, stood to attention. The first time an American medic asked a feverish man to open wide for a dental check, there was confusion, and then laughter. In the Japanese army, dentistry was a luxury reserved for generals. In this camp, it was routine. The hospital, as a weapon of example, U.S. officials knew exactly what they were doing. Treatment of prisoners was not simply humanitarian. It was psychological warfare. The War Department wanted captured Japanese officers to see the moral contrast firsthand. If word of it reached home through Red Cross reports or intercepted letters, so much the better. America's aim was to prove that its strength came from compassion backed by technology. Thus, even under wartime shortages, the Army insisted on maintaining proper infirmaries. Each major camp hospital had surgical theaters, laboratories, radiology rooms, and dental suites. By mid-1944, the Surgeon General's office had standardized procedures. Every POW received dental cleaning every 6 months, fluoroscopic chest exams annually, and access to the same medications issued to U.S. troops, including penicillin once supplies allowed. The results astonished the prisoners. In Imperial Army hospitals, appendectomies were often performed with reused scalpels under morphine alone. In America, they watched surgeries done under ether anesthesia, wounds dressed with sterile gauze, and postoperative antibiotics administered by schedule. Infection rates were almost zero. Shock, denial, and realization. At first, many Japanese officers assumed it was deception, propaganda for their benefit. The Americans must be performing for them, they thought. But days turned to weeks, and the pattern never changed. When one POW broke his arm during camp labor, he was taken immediately to X-ray. The doctor, a captain from Ohio, explained the fracture using the glowing film, pointing to the break line. The Japanese doctor who watched the procedure whispered to another, "We would have said it by guess." In another incident recorded by camp records, a group of captured medical officers were invited to observe dental extractions. They entered the room expecting blood and shouting, what they knew from field hospitals in the tropics. Instead, they saw local anesthesia, careful suction, clean instruments laid out on linen. The prisoner patients left smiling weakly, gauze tucked in their mouths. One Japanese colonel muttered, "The Americans repair even the teeth of the defeated." For men raised to believe mercy weakened discipline, it was a revelation wrapped in confusion. Penicillin, the miracle that defined an era. The greatest shock came from a small glass vial, penicillin sodium, 100,000 units. In 1945, the drug was still scarce even among Allied forces, yet it was standard in every major POW hospital. When Japanese doctors asked about it, American officers explained how it cured infections once fatal, septic wounds, pneumonia, gangrene. The visitors listened in disbelief. In their own military medicine, the best antibiotic had been sulfanilamide, effective but limited. Entire garrisons had been lost to untreated infections. To see a single injection save a man's leg was almost mystical. It is as if they command life itself, one wrote in his notebook. That note, smuggled back to Japan years later, became one of the first descriptions Japanese physicians saw of the new drug. When U.S. occupation forces began distributing penicillin in 1946, those same former POW doctors were among its most vocal advocates. Captivity had become apprenticeship. The transformation of perception. For some, the experience bordered on spiritual collapse. Their empire had promised them superiority, moral, racial, cultural. Yet here they were, being healed by an enemy that seemed to embody the civilization Japan had sought to surpass through conquest. The American wards were clean, disciplined, efficient, the very virtues the Japanese claimed as their own. Many Japanese doctors began quietly assisting in camp infirmaries. They sterilized instruments, translated medical terms, and took notes. The Americans encouraged it. Some even gave them medical journals to read. The Lancet, Journal of the American Medical Association. The pages opened a new world. We studied to survive, one recalled later, but in learning, we began to live differently. By the end of the war, the Japanese POW physicians who passed through American camps had seen something their own system had denied them, a vision of science serving mercy. When they returned home, that vision would help rebuild not only Japan's hospitals, but its conscience, when mercy conflicted with honor. The story of the Japanese POW doctors in America is not only about medicine, it's about world views colliding under a single roof. What happened in those hospital wards was not a contest of weapons, but of values. The shock that rippled through those captured physicians came from something deeper than advanced technology. It came from a revelation that the enemy they had been taught to despise might, in spirit, be more disciplined, humane, and civilized than their own empire. The cult of endurance from childhood, Japanese soldiers, and especially military physicians, had been steeped in the creed of Bushido, the way of the warrior. Suffering was purification. Pain was endurance. To die rather than yield was proof of loyalty. Medical care, within this framework, existed primarily to restore fighting strength, not to comfort or preserve life at all costs. An army surgeon's duty was to return men to battle, not to ease their pain. If a patient could not fight again, he was often left behind. In the field hospitals of the Pacific, Japanese medics performed amputations without anesthesia because supplies were gone or considered wasteful. When morphine ran out, they used belts or sticks for patients to bite. Death was accepted with stoic indifference. In that moral universe, mercy could be misinterpreted as weakness. The wounded were not pitied. They were expected to endure. Prisoners, meanwhile, were already beyond redemption, men who had shamed their families and emperor, and then came captivity in America, where the enemy fed, clothed and healed them without demand for submission or apology. The first cultural shock at Camp McCoy, a Japanese medical officer, Captain Kuroda Masao, watched an American medic change the dressing on a prisoner's infected leg. The wound had been filthy, full of maggots when first treated. Now it was pink and clean, wrapped in sterile gauze. Kuroda asked the American through an interpreter why so much effort was spent on a man who could never fight again. The medic shrugged, because he's a man, same as anyone else. For Kuroda, the simplicity of that answer was destabilizing. He later confessed to another POW, "I thought the Americans were devils, but devils do not heal the wounded." Every encounter with American medical ethics, consent, cleanliness, patient dignity, struck at the foundation of their training. These were not gestures of propaganda. They were habits woven into an entire system. Discipline reimagined in Japanese ideology, discipline meant self-denial and obedience. In American military medicine, it meant procedure and precision. Sterilize, record, recheck, treat. The difference was philosophical. Where one culture sanctified sacrifice, the other sanctified efficiency, yet both claimed moral virtue. To the Japanese doctors, the idea that an American sergeant would scold a nurse for skipping a chart entry was astonishing. The emphasis on record-keeping, hygiene, and the chain of command in the hospital reflected an orderliness equal to any Army drill. It was not softness. It was another kind of discipline. A captured physician later wrote in his diary, "Their kindness is structured, not sentimental. It is their system, not their emotion, that preserves life." For some, the experience was unbearable. A few refused treatment outright, insisting they be left alone to die. One Japanese colonel reportedly turned his face away when an American nurse tried to check his pulse. "A woman cannot touch me," he hissed. But days later, fever forced him to relent. He lived, and afterward thanked her with a trembling bow. Such scenes repeated across the camps. Pride breaking against survival. Every act of care forced the prisoners to confront the contradiction at the heart of their upbringing, that the enemy's humanity might be stronger than their own ideology of glory. American doctors, for their part, often saw the transformation. They noted how the Japanese patients who first refused penicillin later volunteered to help clean the ward. They saw how officers who once refused food began translating medical terms for their fellow prisoners. Compassion was contagious, even among the defeated. Medicine as a mirror. The longer the Japanese doctors worked alongside their captors, the more they realized they were looking at a reflection of what their own profession could have been. They recognized surgical instruments they had read about but never handled. Forceps designed in Rochester, sterilizers manufactured in Chicago. These were not luxuries of empire. They were the tools of a society that had made science and ethics partners rather than rivals. One POW summarized the lesson in a single sentence recorded by a camp chaplain. "They conquer with machines, but they win with morals." He was not speaking of moral superiority in a religious sense, but of a discipline rooted in the belief that civilization itself was measured by how it treated the powerless. That idea, once alien, would outlive the war and outlast the fences that confined them. By the time Japan surrendered, some POW physicians had come to see their captivity not as disgrace, but as education. They began requesting textbooks, asking to study anatomy and surgery under American officers. A few were allowed to assist in post-war medical exchanges when the occupation began. They would later become part of the generation that rebuilt Japan's public health system, importing the standards they had seen behind barbed wire, sterile instruments, systematic nursing, and above all, a belief that medicine's duty was to life itself, not to ideology. In that sense, the American POW hospitals became a strange kind of moral laboratory. Inside them, compassion and procedure forged a quiet victory more enduring than any battle. The technology of mercy. What the Japanese POW doctors witnessed in American camps was not only moral shock, it was a technological revelation. They had stepped from a wartime medical system that still relied on hand-cranked sterilizers and bamboo splints into a world where electricity hummed through every instrument. Machines in America were extensions of compassion. And to men trained in an empire that glorified endurance over innovation, that was both wondrous and humiliating. The machine that saw. Beneath the skin, the most startling device in every American infirmary was the X-ray machine. In Imperial Army hospitals, X-rays were rare, confined to major universities in Tokyo or Osaka. On the battlefield, fractures were set by touch and intuition. When American medics wheeled a patient under a glass tube and, minutes later, produced a glowing film showing bones like white smoke, the Japanese doctors felt they were witnessing magic. For them, medicine had always been tactile, the hand and the knife. The Americans introduced a new sense, vision beyond flesh. The X-ray's steady hum, the smell of ozone, the film dripping in a tray of developer. These sensations stayed with them. It was not just a diagnostic tool, it was a metaphor. The Americans, they realized, were looking inside the world while Japan still treated suffering by tradition. One POW surgeon later told an interpreter, "We could not see inside our wounded. You can. That is why your men live and ours die." In that admission lay the quiet collapse of an old faith, the belief that courage could substitute for science. Penicillin and the power of the invisible. Then, there was penicillin, the true miracle. To Japanese medical officers, infection was the great thief of victory. Their campaigns in China, Burma, and the Pacific had been crippled not by enemy bullets, but by dysentery, tetanus, gangrene, and malaria. For every soldier killed by shellfire, 5 died of disease. They had sulfa drugs, crude, bitter powders, but these merely slowed decay. When they saw the Americans injecting a cloudy solution and saving men already half dead from sepsis, disbelief turned into something deeper, awe. They took notes feverishly. They asked for dosages, mechanisms, side effects. The American officers, amused, explained the basics of bacterial inhibition, of Fleming's discovery, of mass production by Pfizer. To the prisoners, it sounded like a story from another century, a civilization that had learned to defeat nature itself. In one camp report, a Japanese surgeon is quoted saying, "You have conquered death's smallest soldiers. We still fight them with prayers." Penicillin became the most potent symbol of America's invisible power, a weapon that healed rather than destroyed. Dental chair and the philosophy of detail, perhaps the most trivial-seeming revelation, and yet one, that struck the POWs hardest was the dental unit. In Imperial Japan, dentistry was a luxury, a bourgeois indulgence. Soldiers lost teeth to infection or blows and were expected to carry on. The concept of maintaining oral health in a military setting seemed absurd. At Camp Clinton, a Japanese officer sat rigid in a modern dental chair as an American lieutenant adjusted the overhead lamp. The doctor wore gloves. He used a motorized drill. The patient was given Novocaine. When the extraction was done, the American said, "You'll feel better now," and offered a cup of water to rinse. The prisoner wrote later, "They mend even the parts of the body that do not kill. That is how they think. They fix what can be fixed." He had grasped something fundamental. The American medical ethos valued wholeness, not just survival. Every system mattered, even the small, the unseen, the unheroic. Tools as ideology to the POW doctors, the instruments in those wards became emblems of a deeper philosophy. The Americans trusted systems, not individuals. Their instruments were standardized, their procedures written, their sterilizers timed by clock, not instinct. There was no room for mystical authority or ritual. Healing was not art. It was engineering applied to flesh. This precision unnerved men raised in a culture of intuition. But it also fascinated them. Each machine seemed to express a moral argument, that life could be protected through order, that suffering could be reduced by design. And yet there was something profoundly human behind it all. The machines were not trophies. They were extensions of a belief that every life, even an enemy's, was worth saving. The prisoners began to call the infirmary the factory of mercy. The phrase spread quietly among them. Learning by watching. Some of the POW doctors became assistants, allowed to sterilize equipment or prepare patients. They watched operations where bones were pinned with stainless steel rods and burns covered with grafts. Each new technique overturned what they had been taught in wartime Tokyo. They took notes in secret, sketching instruments on scraps of wrapping paper. A few smuggled these drawings home after the war. One of them, later a professor at Kyoto University, introduced standardized surgical sterilization procedures based directly on what he had seen in an American POW camp. Others described how American nurses, all women, commanded respect from male doctors. Their precision, their authority, their calm presence at the surgical table shocked the Japanese officers who had never seen women in such roles. Discipline without cruelty, one of them called it. By the war's end, the lesson was inescapable. The Americans' victory was not just industrial or military. It was moralized through technology. X-rays, penicillin, dental drills, and sterilizers were tools of civilization that carried ideological weight. They were proof that modernity could be both efficient and ethical. One POW surgeon summed it up years later. We worshipped death and called it honor. They served life and called it duty. That realization, more than surrender itself, marked the beginning of Japan's transformation after 1945. When American occupation authorities reformed Japan's medical system, many of the consultants were former POW physicians who had once stood awestruck in those camp hospitals. Their first recommendation was simple. Every hospital must have an X-ray room, a sterilizer, and a dental clinic. In those clean, humming rooms behind barbed wire, the instruments of defeat became the blueprints of rebirth. But the deepest change was yet to come. A confrontation not of science, but of conscience. The day they understood why they lost. The day began with frost on the wire. It was October 1945, weeks after Japan's formal surrender, and the morning fog hung over Camp McCoy like a veil. Inside the compound, a handful of Japanese POW doctors were ordered to report to the infirmary for what they were told would be a joint medical inspection. They expected interrogation. What they received instead was invitation. When they arrived, an American major, Dr. William Anders, Army Medical Corps, greeted them with an almost casual courtesy. He motioned toward the examination ward, where a line of prisoners waited for routine checkups. "Gentlemen," he said through an interpreter, "today you will assist us." The statement hung in the air. Assist. Not observe, not stand aside. The captives were being treated as colleagues. Inside the ward, the room smelled of antiseptic and soap, a scent of civilization. A young American nurse moved briskly between tables, her rank insignia glinting on her sleeve. The Japanese officers stiffened instinctively. They had never seen a woman command such authority. The nurse adjusted the settings on an X-ray unit and called for a patient. A gaunt prisoner stepped forward. "Dr. Sato," said Major Anders, "you'll handle this one with us." Sato hesitated. He was a surgeon who had served in Burma, accustomed to performing amputations on the floor of jungle huts. The last X-ray he'd seen had been before the war, in a Tokyo teaching hospital that no longer existed. Now, under fluorescent lights, he watched as the machine whirred and a ghostly image appeared on the viewing screen. Anders gestured for him to look. Hairline fracture. Radius. Clean break. We'll splint and monitor. Sato studied the glowing bones and said softly in Japanese, "We would have guessed and hoped." The inspection turned into a demonstration of everything the Japanese had never believed possible in captivity. Prisoners were examined, vaccinated, and logged by serial number. Every instrument was sterilized, every chart neatly filed. At the end of the line, dental work was being done under local anesthesia. A Japanese prisoner reclined calmly while a lieutenant in white gloves operated a foot-powered suction pump. Dr. Nakahara, another captured surgeon, leaned toward Anders and asked through the interpreter, "Is this how you treat all prisoners?" Anders nodded. "The law says we must treat them as we treat our own." The words landed like a blow. As we treat our own, Nakahara turned away, his face pale. He thought of his own patients in Burma. Men who had begged for morphine that never came, who had died because supply ships never reached them. He had watched them rot, had called their deaths honorable. Now he realized it had been neglect, not nobility. The moment of realization. That afternoon, Anders gathered the group in the ward's small conference room. On the table were several items, an X-ray film, a stethoscope, and a vial of penicillin. He held up the vial. "This," he said, "saves lives that courage cannot." He explained how the U.S. Army had mass-produced the antibiotic, hundreds of millions of units a month, because no soldier's life, even the lowest private's, was considered expendable. Dr. Sato translated the words for the others. No one spoke for a long time. Then one of the older Japanese doctors, his hands trembling, murmured, "We called ourselves men of science, but we worshipped death." No one contradicted him. Breaking the silence, Major Anders, sensing the gravity of the moment, dismissed the group. But the Japanese lingered in the ward, staring at the instruments they had just used. They traced the smooth handles of scalpels, the polished surface of the sterilizer, the labels written in precise English script. For the first time since their capture, the humiliation of defeat gave way to something purer, understanding. They had not been beaten merely by bombs or numbers. They had been surpassed by a civilization that believed mercy was strength. Sato later wrote in his camp diary, one of the few that survived repatriation, "Today I saw the reason we lost. It was not the B-29. It was the hospital." A quiet ceremony. Before they left, Anders did something unexpected. He lined the Japanese doctors before the ward and saluted them. "You fought bravely," he said, "and now you serve by learning." One by one, the prisoners returned the salute, hesitant, then firm. The gesture, simple and silent, marked the end of one world and the beginning of another. That night, they could not sleep. The hum of the X-ray generator still echoed in their minds, the sound of a machine that could see through flesh and through illusions. The operation that ended the war. Twice. The snow had come early that year. By November 1945, Camp McCoy's fields were covered in white, the fences rimed with ice. Inside the infirmary, the stove clattered, radiators hissing like low steam engines. The war was officially over, but the camp still held several hundred Japanese prisoners awaiting repatriation. Among them were 6 medical officers, surgeons, dentists, and medics, who had been quietly assisting the American staff. One morning, Major William Anders called them into the operating theater. His tone was brisk but respectful. "We'll be doing a laparotomy today. You'll assist if you wish." The prisoner on the table was one of their own, a Japanese private suffering from acute appendicitis. The choice was deliberate. Anders wanted them to see and to join a kind of healing their army had never permitted. One enemy treating another, both in the service of life. The preparation. The Japanese doctors washed in silence at the scrub sink. The water was hot, the soap fragrant, and the unfamiliar latex gloves squeaked under their hands. They were issued sterile gowns, masks, and caps. As they stepped into the bright-lit room, the air smelled of ether and alcohol. The American surgical team worked like a single organism. Nurses checking pulse and pressure, orderlies adjusting instruments, Anders and his anesthetist murmuring in shorthand. The Japanese physicians stood on the opposite side of the table, eyes fixed on the operation site. For the first time in their professional lives, they were part of a system where every action was timed, every motion rehearsed, no raised voices, no improvisation, no hierarchy of fear. There was command, but it was cooperative. Each person, regardless of rank, existed to make the patient live. One Japanese surgeon, Dr. Nakahara, later recalled the moment. "We did not breathe." Their calmness was unnatural. It was as if they fought death itself, not the man on the table. The operation, the incision was clean, a single stroke under the bright lamp. Anders talked them through every step: clamp, ligature, cut, suction. The appendix, swollen and pale, came free within minutes. A nurse recorded the time. Every instrument was counted, every swab noted. The Japanese watched as the cavity was flushed, closed, and bandaged in layers. No shouting, no panic. Just precision. When it was done, the patient's pulse remained steady. Anders looked up and nodded. He'll recover. 2 days on broth, penicillin every 6 hours. Dr. Sato, standing beside him, bowed slightly, a reflex that came from deep habit. But this time it meant gratitude, not subservience. "You have taught us more than a victory could," he said through the interpreter. Anders hesitated, then replied quietly, "It isn't victory. It's medicine, the aftermath of a single operation. That single surgery spread through the camp like rumor and scripture. The Japanese guards whispered that the Americans had performed a miracle. The patient survived, smiling weakly within 48 hours. He would later tell an officer, "The enemy saved my life while my country abandoned me." For the POW doctors, the operation was a revelation. They had seen efficiency before, but not empathy woven so tightly into it. The Americans' calm wasn't arrogance, it was mastery. They had built a discipline where compassion was method, not weakness. That night, the Japanese physicians met in their barracks, scribbling notes by candlelight. They drew diagrams of the surgical setup, the lamp arrangement, the sterilizer's design. They argued over dosage measurements and anesthesia ratios. Every detail mattered, not because they were ordered to learn, but because they wanted to remember. "We thought we knew civilization," Nakahara wrote later. "Now we have seen it." The following week, Major Anders received a formal letter written in Japanese, translated by the interpreter. It was signed collectively by the POW doctors. The message was short, deliberate, and dignified. "We came here as men of war. We will return as students of life. You have defeated us with kindness stronger than weapons." Anders kept the letter for decades. When he retired, he reportedly said, "I saw the war end twice, once in Tokyo Bay and once in that operating room." The transformation was complete. Those 6 men, when repatriated in 1946, carried home not only memories, but notebooks filled with surgical procedures, hygiene standards, and sketches of sterilizers and X-ray machines. Within 5 years, Japan's hospitals would begin to mirror those same systems. Their empire had fallen to firebombs, but their civilization would rise again through penicillin and protocol. The story of that operation marked the human climax of the entire Pacific conflict, where enemies became collaborators under a shared light, but the consequences would ripple far beyond that winter ward. What began as a lesson in captivity would soon shape an entire nation's rebirth, the lessons that crossed the ocean. When the gates of Camp McCoy finally opened in early 1946, the departing Japanese prisoners were issued new uniforms, Red Cross parcels, and papers of repatriation. Snow still lined the fences as the trucks rolled toward the railway that would take them west, to San Francisco, then across the Pacific, back to a homeland in ruins. Behind them, the barracks stood empty, the hospital silent except for the ticking of the sterilizer cooling down for the last time. Among those leaving were the 6 doctors who had assisted Major William Anders. They carried nothing outwardly unusual: a few clothes, notebooks, letters, but within those notebooks were sketches of X-ray units, descriptions of sterilization cycles, lists of surgical instruments, and paragraphs copied from American medical manuals. The guards who searched them never realized they were escorting the seeds of Japan's post-war medical revolution, the return to a ruined nation. When the ships reached Yokohama, the sight was apocalyptic. Smoke still rose from the ruins. Hospitals were collapsed shells, laboratories shattered, and most doctors were working without power or supplies. Japan had lost not only a war but an entire infrastructure. Medicine had reverted to the 19th century. The returning POW physicians walked ashore as ghosts from another civilization. They spoke of American hospitals as if describing another planet. Rooms that glowed with electric light, instruments that killed bacteria, drugs that reversed infection in hours. Their peers in Tokyo listened in disbelief. Some dismissed their stories as exaggerations born of captivity. But then came the first shipments of penicillin, distributed under U.S. occupation forces. Within months, those same skeptics watched patients rise from beds once thought fatal. They said the Americans were devils, one returning surgeon told a colleague. If so, then the devils have learned mercy better than we have learned war. The U.S. Supreme Commander for the Allied Powers, SCAP, under General Douglas MacArthur, had begun reconstructing Japan's social institutions, law, education, and medicine. One of their first steps was establishing the Public Health and Welfare Section, staffed by American medical officers. And among their Japanese assistants were men who had been POWs. They served as interpreters, liaisons, and silent teachers. Major Anders himself, though he never returned to Japan, received a letter that year from a Tokyo medical officer thanking him for lessons given without words. SCAP's policies imposed compulsory vaccination programs, modern sanitation laws, and the licensing of hospitals according to American standards. The old hierarchy, where doctors served the army first and the public second, began to erode. For the first time, Japanese nurses were formally trained in hygiene and patient care modeled after the American system. The same deference once reserved for officers was now extended to those who saved lives. Penicillin and the New Japan by 1947. Japanese pharmaceutical companies, under American technical supervision, began local production of penicillin. It was the first mass-produced antibiotic in the country, nicknamed the miracle drug. One of the key consultants in that program was Dr. Kuroda, formerly a prisoner at Camp McCoy. His field notes, written in broken English, became templates for early Japanese dosage manuals. The drug's arrival changed not just medicine, but mentality. For generations, Japanese soldiers and civilians had accepted disease as divine punishment or proof of fate. Now, they saw illness as a problem solvable by human reason. Hospitals that once relied on herbal poultices installed sterilizers and began keeping infection logs. In that shift, from fatalism to empirical trust, the psychological war was finally won. We learned from them how to fight death without hatred, Kuroda wrote in a 1951 journal article. This was America's greatest lesson, the chain reaction of modernity. Those 6 camp-trained doctors trained dozens more. The knowledge they brought spread through medical schools in Kyoto, Osaka, and Tokyo University. They translated English journals, demonstrated sterilization procedures, and designed hospital wards around cleanliness rather than hierarchy. Some of their students went on to become the architects of Japan's universal healthcare system in the 1950s. Their legacy was quiet, invisible, but foundational. The empire that had once glorified death now built its peace on the preservation of life. And at its center stood men who had seen the enemy's humanity under fluorescent light and decided to replicate it. The irony of civilization. In later interviews, several former POW physicians admitted that their transformation began the moment they realized American compassion was methodical, not sentimental. It was a system, scalable, industrial, precise. The same country that dropped atomic bombs also mass-produced antibiotics. To them, that contradiction was unbearable and yet undeniable. One doctor, Dr. Nakahara, later wrote, "The Americans showed us that a nation can manufacture mercy as efficiently as bullets. That is why they won." And in that paradox lay the blueprint of modern Japan, a society rebuilt by the very principles it had once dismissed as weakness. But the transformation wasn't merely technical or institutional. It was moral. The men who had stood frozen in that Wisconsin infirmary would spend the rest of their lives reconciling 2 truths: that they had served an empire that glorified death, and that they had been redeemed by enemies who healed, the healers of the defeated. By 1948, the Japanese doctors who had once stood behind barbed wire in Wisconsin were back in practice. Their uniforms were gone, their swords confiscated, but their hands still bore the memory of clean gloves, bright lights, and orderly precision. Yet homecoming was not triumph. It was a reckoning. Japan had changed, but not enough. In hospitals from Tokyo to Hiroshima, scarcity ruled. Nurses washed gauze for reuse. Operations were performed with candlelight when power failed. And behind every whispered conversation lay the ghost of defeat, a shame that lingered deeper than rubble. The former POW doctors tried to introduce what they had seen. They spoke of sterile instruments, of recording patient data, of nurses with authority and structure. They were often met with suspicion. "You learned from the enemy," some colleagues said. "Why should we trust their ways?" Dr. Sato, who had assisted Major Anders in that historic appendectomy, answered simply, because their ways saved our men when our ways did not. It wasn't ideology he defended. It was efficacy. And in time, his results silenced the skeptics. Teaching the new doctrine Sato took a post at Kyoto Imperial University, where he began training students using American-style curricula. Every session began with a ritual: clean hands, sterilized instruments, measured procedure. His assistants thought him obsessive, until infection rates plummeted. By 1950, his surgical ward had the lowest mortality rate in the prefecture. He called it discipline through compassion. Dr. Nakahara, meanwhile, joined the Public Health Bureau in Tokyo. He helped design rural vaccination programs, insisting that medical aid be delivered even to the poorest villages. When questioned why a former army surgeon now served peasants, he replied, "Because in America, I saw a soldier and a farmer receive the same injection. That is civilization." Through quiet persistence, these men reshaped the meaning of honor. It was no longer about dying well. It was about keeping others alive. The struggle with memory. Yet none of them escaped the weight of what they had seen. Every act of mercy in their new clinics reminded them of cruelty once justified as patriotism. When Sato lectured about penicillin, he often paused mid-sentence, as if remembering a patient who could have been saved years earlier. In private journals, they confessed to nightmares, of field hospitals full of flies, of soldiers begging for anesthesia that never came. The gleaming American infirmary stood in their minds like a cathedral of light haunting a burnt-out temple. "We were priests of death," Nakahara wrote in 1953, "until we saw men worship life with science." These writings, later collected by post-war historians, became invaluable testimonies of conscience. They revealed that the true wound left by the war was moral, not physical. A nation learns. From its captives by the mid-1950s, Japan's reconstruction was accelerating. The same doctors once accused of weakness were now hailed as pioneers of modern medicine. When penicillin factories expanded, several of them were invited to advise on protocols. Their notes, written originally on scrap paper in American camps, became blueprints for quality control and sterilization standards across Japanese industry. Ironically, the knowledge learned in captivity began defining post-war Japanese innovation. Precision, cleanliness, efficiency, respect for process. What had once been symbols of humiliation became the foundation of national pride. Newspapers of the period carried headlines celebrating Japan's medical miracle. But the men who had first seen it in action never claimed credit. They saw themselves merely as witnesses, custodians of a truth that mercy could be engineered. The human bridge, some of those former POW doctors would later host American medical delegations in the 1950s. When the first group arrived in 1956, they were astonished to find wards in Tokyo General Hospital organized with the same layout as Camp McCoy's infirmary. Identical bed spacing, identical sterilizer models, even X-ray machines from U.S. suppliers. During one visit, an elderly Japanese surgeon approached the Americans, bowed deeply and said in fluent English, "Welcome to the house that began in your prison." The Americans did not know his name. It was Dr. Sato. His words captured the strange poetry of the age. An empire reborn through the discipline of its conquerors, not their domination. Legacy of a different kind of victory. By the time these men passed away in the 1960s and 70s, Japan had become a nation synonymous with technological precision and medical advancement. Their students would pioneer heart surgery, antibiotics research, and global health outreach, all guided by systems first glimpsed behind barbed wire. But none of them ever forgot the contradiction, at the core of it all, that civilization's greatest strength had revealed itself not through conquest, but through compassion in uniform. "They defeated us," Nakahara wrote in his final notebook, "not with fear, but with order, cleanliness, and mercy. We tried to build empire through blood. They built humanity through medicine. That was the final inheritance of those POW doctors. Not shame, but clarity. They returned from captivity not broken, but converted. Proof that even in total defeat, a nation can be remade by the better angels of its enemy. Mercy as the final weapon. In the end, no monument was ever built for the Japanese doctors of Camp McCoy. No statue marks the ward where enemy and victor stood shoulder to shoulder over a single wounded man. Their names faded into hospital records and university archives, their stories absorbed by a nation eager to forget captivity. But their legacy lives quietly in every clean operating room Japan built after 1945. In the stainless trays, the sterilizers that hiss with precision, the order that hums beneath the surface. They had gone to war believing civilization was a mask for weakness, that honor required hardness. And yet, behind barbed wire in a foreign winter, they discovered that true discipline lies not in how well men die, but in how carefully they save one another. The Americans never intended those hospitals to be sermons. They were simply following procedure, obeying the Geneva Convention, doing their duty. But in doing so, they turned medicine into revelation. Every vial of penicillin, every X-ray, every gloved hand reaching across language and loss whispered the same truth. Mercy is method. That idea would cross the Pacific and take root in the soil of defeat. It would transform Japan's hospitals, its schools, its conscience, turning the instruments of surrender into tools of rebirth. What began as the humiliation of prisoners became the enlightenment of a nation. When Dr. Sato was once asked, late in life, what he remembered most from captivity, he did not speak of hunger or fences or interrogation. He paused, then said, "The smell of antiseptic, the light over the table, the way the enemy cleaned his hands before saving a life." In that gesture, small, unremarkable routine, lay the quiet victory of the modern world. For the war that burned cities ended in a place of healing, where enemies discovered that the purest form of strength is the will to preserve life, even when it belongs to the fallen, and in the cold light of that realization, history itself seemed to exhale, for it had found at last something worth surviving for,